Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we are checking out the new 12nm version of the Ryzen 5 1600. And despite the name, this is actually a new CPU. It's only been on the market now for a few months. Ideally, I would have liked to have covered it a bit sooner than I have, but unfortunately, it isn't available in Australia, so we've had to source one from overseas and it's taken a little over a month to get here. My shipping options were limited. Anyway, the good news is we finally have this strange CPU on hand for testing. But before any of that, today's video is sponsored by PC Case Gear, Australia's premier online PC store. Whenever I'm in the need for a product, they're the first place I turn to, and I've been a customer of theirs for years now, so I really can attest to the quality of their service. I value their broad product range, competitive pricing, customer support, and easy to navigate website. With 2 decades of experience, I know I can trust PC Case Gear to look after you guys as well as they look after me. So for more information, please check the link in the video description. So we'll probably do a quick recap first. The Ryzen 5 1600 that was released back in April 2017 for $220 US, and it's of course based on the original 14nm Zen architecture. Its 6 cores came clocked at 3.2 GHz for the base, with an all-core boost clock of 3.4 GHz, and it was cooled using the Wraith Spire. A year later, it was replaced by the Ryzen 5 2600 at $200 US. It too was a 6-core processor, but this time featured updated 12nm Zen Plus cores. For the clock speeds, it ran at a base of 3.4 GHz with an all-core of 3.7 GHz, and because the newer process was more efficient, AMD downgraded the cooler to the Wraith Stealth. The following year, which was 2019, we of course got the Zen 2 based processors, and the replacement here was the Ryzen 5 3600, another $200 part. What we also got last year was a sort of Ryzen 5 1600 refresh. Bizarrely, AMD released a really cheap version of the Ryzen 5 2600, but just called it the Ryzen 5 1600. Now commonly referred to as the Ryzen 5 1600 AF, it's very different to the original Ryzen 5 1600 AE model. Despite the name, this really is a 2nd gen Ryzen part. Essentially, it is an R5 2600 with a very slight decrease in clock speed. Apparently, AMD didn't have enough 14nm wafers available to keep producing the R5 1600 on that process, so they've shifted it to 12nm. Very strange, that one. Didn't even know they were still making Ryzen 1000 series parts, but apparently they are. And they've chose to call this one, which is, as I said, it's now technically a Ryzen 5 2600 with a slight clock speed, so decrease. So rather than refresh it as a Ryzen 3000 series part or even call it a Ryzen 2000 series part, they're calling it the R5 1600. Very bizarre, not sure why they've chosen to do that, but they have. Just a very odd situation. So I guess at this point, you could be asking yourself, why do you care about any of this? Why do you care that AMD is making new products and then selling them under old names? Does seem counterproductive, but hey, it's AMD, they do strange things all the time. Well, the reason why you should care is the price. This slightly underclocked Ryzen 5 2600 costs just $85 US, and that's brand new. So yeah, you can buy a Zen Plus 6-core 12-thread CPU for just $85 US brand new. The original 14nm Ryzen 5 1600 was already a great deal, a little over $100 US, and the Ryzen 5 2600 was a killer deal at $120. But the Ryzen 5 1600 AF blows them both completely out of the water at just $85 US. Unfortunately, while great news for US viewers, this amazing value Ryzen 5 processor isn't available in all regions, and my fellow Aussies will miss out. I myself had to pay way more than what these things are worth to review it, because sadly they just aren't available locally. I have asked AMD if the AF variant will be coming down under, but for now it seems like the answer is no, so yeah, that really does suck. Now, before we get into the blue bar graphs, here's a quick look at how the 1600 AF clocks compared to the 1600 AE, as well as the 2600. Running a core-heavy Blender workload, we see that the original 1600 operates at 3.4 GHz, whereas the new AF model maintained 3.7 GHz, and then the 2600 runs 100 MHz higher at 3.8 GHz. So it looks like the 1600 AF will be, worst case, up to 3% slower than the 2600 out of the box, but it costs just $85 US. Okay, so armed with that information, let's jump into some blue bar graphs. Though please note we are going to power through these results as they aren't particularly surprising and probably won't require too much explanation. For testing, I'm using the Gigabyte X570 Aorus Master with 16GB of G-Skill's Flare X DDR4 3200 memory, and the graphics card of choice is the GeForce RTX 2080 Ti. First up, we have the Cinebench R20 multi-core performance, and here the 1600 AF basically matched the 2600, less than a 1% margin in it. This means out of the box, the AF was 12% faster than the original 1600. Now, for single core performance, the 2600 was 1.5% faster than the 1600 AF, and that makes the new 12nm 1600 10% faster than the original version. Running 7-zip, we see basically identical compression performance. Again, the AF is about 10% faster than the original 1600. For the decompression test, the 2600 was again 1.5% faster than the 1600 AF, which means the AF was 9% faster than the original 1600. The last application benchmark I bothered running was Blender. Here the 1600 AF was about 1% slower than the 2600, so no real surprises there. Time for some gaming benchmarks, and first up we have Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and the 1600 AF delivers basically the same performance as the R5 2600, making it a little bit faster than the original 1600. As expected, the margins are also very similar at 1440p. Performance in Battlefield 5 is also very similar between the original 1600, the 1600 AF, and the R5 2600. And of course, it's the same story at 1440p. So I suspect with a lesser graphics card, you can expect to see no real difference at all. The 1600 AF matched the 2600 with identical performance in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, making it a few frames faster than the original model, and we see basically identical margins at 1440p. We also see identical gaming performance from the 1600 AF when compared to the 2600 when playing The Division 2. The results at 1440p are no different, and here we see more evidence that the 1600 and 1600 AF will really deliver a very similar gaming experience with a lower tier GPU. Next up we have Far Cry New Dawn, and yeah, pretty similar sight here. The 1600 AF basically matches the 2600, making it a little faster than the original, which is of course the true 1600. 1440p doesn't offer up any surprises, so just more of the same here. Here we see a nice 13% boost to the 1% low performance for the 1600 AF over the 1600 and Hitman 2 at 1080p, so that's a pretty solid gain there, and it meant the refresh 1600 was able to basically match the 2600, and we see that the 1% low margin extended to 16% at 1440p, but overall margins were much the same. The 1600 AF also demonstrated good 1% low performance improvements in Total War 3 Kingdoms, beating the 1600 by a 16% margin at 1080p, coming in 1 to 2 FPS behind the 2600. The margins are reduced slightly at 1440p, but overall a very similar story. Well, there's my quick look at how the Ryzen 5 1600 AF performs, and the results went pretty much as expected. It's an R5 2600 with a very minor reduction in clock speed. Speaking of which, you can of course overclock this part if you want. The 1600 AF is a fully unlocked Ryzen processor, and my chip hit 4.2 GHz using 1.4 volts, and that is the same overclock I achieved by my Ryzen 5 2600 retail part that I have on hand. Didn't bother going into all those results because it's more of the same. Hit the same frequency, you get very, very similar performance at that frequency. And the other reason I don't like to delve into overclocking too much with these sort of CPU reviews is that your chip may not do 4.2 GHz, it may only do 4 GHz, or could do better. Again, it's silicon quality here. That's what they call it, the silicon lottery. So yeah, your results may vary, but I'd expect around 4.1 to 4.2 GHz. And based on reports that I'm seeing, 4.2 GHz does seem to be a pretty strong overclock. And that certainly was the case with the 2600 CPUs that we've tested. I've bought about probably a dozen of those now. Haven't overclocked all of them, but did overclock about half a dozen of them. They all did around 4.1, 4.2 GHz. Our Ryzen 5 1600 retail chip, that does 4 GHz on the dot. Can't really push it above that without compromising stability, and that seems to be about as good as those chips do. There are reports of some chips going higher, but I think the sort of realistic overclock you can hope to achieve would be 4 GHz with that particular part. So the 1600 AF is not only cheaper than the original 1600 and faster out of the box, but it should also overclock a bit better as well. At the very least, your chances of hitting or exceeding 4 GHz are greatly improved. As for power consumption, it's in line with what we've seen from the 2600, it's just a little bit better out of the box due to slightly decreased clock speeds, but this can vary depending on silicon quality. For budget builders with access to the 1600 AF at $85 US, there is simply no better choice. As I said earlier, the R5 2600 was already amazing value at $120 US, so the 1600 AF, which is basically the same CPU for a further $35 off, is just an insane deal. Has to be said, AMD really is putting the hurt on Intel with these parts, at least, you know, lower end CPUs, your Core i5s and lower, because right now something like the Core i5 9600K, that costs $240 US, and then the locked Core i5 9400F, that comes in at $165, and I expect both these 6-core, 6-threaded processors to actually end up being slower than the 1600AF for gaming within a few years from now. So for me, that just makes the Ryzen processor a better buy, not just because it's significantly cheaper, well, that's the main reason, but also the fact that if you're planning on keeping it for 1-2 years, I expect by that point that the 1600AF will be the superior gamer, at least in the majority of really demanding titles. Overall though, as I said, Ryzen 5 1600AF is just an amazing value product. I'm just very dirty on AMD for not bringing it to Australia and then other regions that could benefit from having an affordable 6-core 12-thread Ryzen CPU on the menu. Who knows, it may end up coming down under or to your region if you don't have it now, but yeah, I wouldn't remain too hopeful on that one. I've asked AMD, they haven't given me too much information apart from the fact that there's no plans at this point, so yeah, probably not going to happen. I think they're quite content selling us the Ryzen 5 2600. That's around $200 Australian at this point, so that's a good price. I guess we can't hate on AMD too much over that one, but still the 1600AF, bit jealous of US viewers who have access to that on Amazon for $85. That's just an incredible buy. Please AMD, give some love down under, send a couple of them our way. Seems like they're not going to, but we can at least beg, I suppose. But yeah, that's going to do it for this video. Thank you for watching. If you'd like to get more involved with the Hardware Unboxed channel, we have our Patreon link thing in the description. You can click on that. You get access to our monthly live stream that Tim and I do once a month. We have Q&A. We have our Discord server. There's a heap of cool stuff, so check that out if you're interested. We also have merch. Pretty cool stuff if you're interested in that. And yeah, that's going to do it for this one. Thank you for watching. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.